Great, thanks, Leslie. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see some names that I recognise on the call, and welcome to those of you that haven't joined us before. So this is sort of return after a little bit of a break over a short summer, it feels, without any travel from my point of view anyway. But I'm donning my slightly autumnal scarf and ready for another session with Patrick. So as Leslie said, today's topic, we wanted to focus on stakeholder engagement. And I think particularly why stakeholder engagement now? There are very good reasons why focusing on the board's role in stakeholder engagement has shifted and changed over the last few months because of COVID. But also there are changes in the regulations for boards that require that they report differently on how they engage with stakeholders. So there's sort of two kind of core drivers in terms of why the board's role is shifting in how they engage with stakeholders and thinking about who their stakeholders are. And both Patrick and I seem to have been busy working with boards on thinking about their stakeholder plans and stakeholder maps over the last month or so particularly. So we thought we'd like to get your experiences of what your boards are doing, how you're tackling stakeholders, but also just share some of our experiences of the work that we've been doing and the thoughts that we've had around it. I was going to kick off in a minute with a poll, but I thought I might just let Patrick have a word or two to get us started. We were talking earlier about how stakeholder theory is not a new thing, but certainly perhaps the emphasis has changed, hasn't it, Patrick?
Oh, I think significantly. Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think Edward Freeman in 1984 from the University of Virginia sort of wrote a sort of seminal piece around this. And actually, one of the things I think is that a lot of people have different thoughts about what stakeholder management or engagement is, but he defined it really quite neatly, I thought. He said it's basically, who's a stakeholder? Well, it's anyone who affects or is affected by our organization, which I think is really neat. I think the game has moved on. I think, you've talked about COVID. Well, focus on employees has been, keeping them safe in particular has been sort of hugely high. I think be good to do the poll, and then what might be worth thinking about is, why is it become more important? What are the key drivers, and what are boards doing at the moment? That might be the sort of route we go, and we'll watch assiduously on the Q&A and chat to get your input too.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks, Leslie. Here's the poll. Does your board have a clearly agreed stakeholder management strategy? And I might add a kind of meaning, a word to that, which is around meaningful. I think boards often have a document that says it's a stakeholder management strategy, but what we're interested in is that something that's clearly agreed, and is it meaningful and purposeful, and do you feel like it's at the heart of your the way your board is working with stakeholders? So we'll just let you complete that, and when Leslie's sure of her answers, we'll put that up.
And so shall I sort of talk very briefly then about the drivers and how I've seen those sort of change while waiting for the result? So I think the two main drivers, I mean, you'd expect this with my private equity background to have this one first, I think it's a big driver of value creation. I mean, for me, having happy customers, a happy staff, happy suppliers, happy communities who you work with, actually, you'll end up making more money if you do that. And the accountability is the big second one. Looking at this, actually, it says 49% not yet there, but we're working on it. And 37% no, and don't have any plans to develop one either. So it'd be interesting to get some views as to why. I think one issue is what's the board's role as opposed to the executive's role. So some boards feel, well, that's the job of management to do that. My view is actually it's the job of the board in terms of good governance, having the right strategy and having the right people. It's your job to make sure that there is a stakeholder engagement strategy. It's a good one, it's working, and you know how it's working because you've got some data and metrics to it. It's the executive's job to be the key implementers of that. But if you're a chair in a public company, you have to have good relationships with the shareholders. You're probably doing quite a bit of community stuff with the staff. You've got a lot of key stakeholders, key customers. You're probably actually doing more than you might be kind of thinking about, because it's just what you do, but it's effectively that. One of the things that I think is interesting, there's a very good paper from Cranfield, but that also was quite a while ago, I think 2009, by two guys called Jeffrey and Neely. And they basically said that they had the sort of 3 stages of your approach to this. One was you're in crisis, which I suspect this morning, RTZ, whose CEO's just resigned this morning because they'd blown up some Aboriginal heritage site. Yeah. So this describes a sort of company that sort of ended up in crisis around its stakeholders. It's reactive, it's vulnerable, it has an episodic approach to stakeholders. So if something happens, it goes and deals with it, and then it waits for something else to happen, and then it goes and deals with that. It's not sort of planned. Whereas if you're managing your stakeholders, it's proactive. You anticipate issues your stakeholders might have. It's regular. It's a sort of process. It's not sort of sporadic, but it's still a little defensive. It's about protection rather than being positive about stakeholder management. But if you're engaged, these guys said, you're interactive as opposed to proactive or reactive. You're encouraging, so you actually want to hear from your stakeholders. It's inclusive, and very critically, in my view, is you're prepared to change. And I remember when doing this for 3i, when I was there, when we came up with ours, it was all about the mindset was, what can we learn from these people so we keep them happier. They do more business with us. We have less hassle from people. It was a sort of, we want to learn. And I think if you've got a learning mindset around this, then I think it's much more straightforward to do. And in order to do that, you then need, Jeffrey Neely came up with something I think is really useful, which is what they called a performance prism. So you take whatever might be your 5 or 6 top stakeholder sort of groups or bubbles, and you figure out what their wants and needs are, and you figure out what your wants and needs are for them, and then you put in whatever the metrics are that you need to track whether you're delivering on those things that you think are really important to them and you think are really important to you about them. So anyone who's a public company, you'll have shareholder tracking systems as part of your investor relations policy. The data's there. It's just probably not all pulled together in a sort of dashboard of how are we doing with these different groups that really matter to us. Do we understand as a board, where we are, who's getting grumpy at the moment, who really likes us, what do we need to do? I'll probably pause there, Leslie, because that's quite a chunk.
Yeah, but I was just thinking, Patrick, what from your point of view now has put this onto your agenda in a way which you're so interested in it? Because I mean, obviously there is COVID, and COVID is really, if you look at the data, I think most of it would say that most companies are paying a lot more attention to their employees as stakeholders, and we've talked about that in our past webinars. But is there anything else that is really highlighted from your point of view, the importance of stakeholder management at this particular point in time?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things in addition to the obvious one, which has been the employees. I think suppliers has been really, really critical. I think communities as well, because if you're a company in one of the places with increased restrictions at the moment, you've got an interest in helping to get those restrictions reduced through the things that you can do. It's not your responsibility to do that, but you've got an interest in helping, for example. The other thing I think is around the interconnectedness. I think many people have realized, although it was sort of obvious, how more interconnected we really are, how much more dependent we are on other groups than we perhaps might have thought. And actually, you know, you can be as self-focused as you like, but you could be prevented from doing what you want to do because of a problem someone else has got. And then the third thing, which I think is a major thing, which I've seen around this is more in the larger corporate space, around the whole stakeholder engagement, is it's much easier now because of data to actually understand better, you know, what people are doing. So, for example, you know, you don't need to ask your employees if they're unhappy if you know the churn you've got is 30%. Similarly with your customers, you know, if you've got that data, you know, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but I'm saying actually there's a massive signal there. So the ability to collect, manage, present data, I think, is giving boards new tools to understand things which before you needed to conduct surveys or you needed to do a big piece of work, and the robustness was always questionable and so on. Now the challenge with this is that I think most organizations probably only use, you know, there's been some research on this, I think from IBM, that most organizations only use less than 10% of the data they've got in the cupboard or in the on the servers. So I think a good board actually is asking, you know, what's our data strategy? You know, what data we're collecting, what data we're using about these stakeholder groups, and what actually aren't we collecting that would be really helpful to know, and then having a thing around that so that you can actually have your views and decisions well informed. So I think data, suppliers, interconnectivity are just three things that have changed, I think, or perceptions have changed about them, as well as abilities or capabilities to make it more of a thing now than perhaps it was.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I might almost add to that. The interconnectivity thing is so important, isn't it? But I might also add to that the degree of ambiguity that businesses are working through means that actually they're more perhaps open-minded to recognizing that certain stakeholder groups can have influence. And I think when you start to see that shift at a board on a business, something having more influence and being more of an obvious lever, then you start to see the board start to pay more attention. And I think that's partly what I'm experiencing, is that some of the boards that I'm working with, you know, they've seen that actually the impact their suppliers can have on them. They've seen in a way that they've never seen before, that actually the employees can be really helpful in thinking about when's the right time to come back to work, what's possible, what's not possible. And perhaps they've seen stakeholder groups that they never would have considered to need to have a voice or an influence. And so that kind of importance of the board role starts to, you know, you start to get a kind of focus on these different groups of people in a way that perhaps you never had before. I mean, you know, a really stupid and obvious local example. I live very near to a school. I don't have children, so I don't necessarily consider myself, or hadn't considered myself, a stakeholder. But all of a sudden, I find the school has become incredibly interested in how residents think about the school children, how they arrive at school and not. And, you know, I never would have even considered really that to be part of my domain of influence.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges, I think the phrase stakeholder engagement and even the word stakeholder, you know, to many people sounds a bit fluffy and kind of new age and not really kind of, you know, not really capitalist, sort of not really red meat enough. And I remember CI trying to come up with something that was a bit better. And the best thing I came up with was, you know, it's actually a keep everybody happy strategy, because then they'll do more business with us, type of thing, rather than, because there seemed to be amongst some parts of some people in the company were just sort of, the word stakeholder seemed to sort of be a red flag almost, and so maybe it's the wrong term. although I think it does actually, someone who's got a stake in what you're doing is sort of, it is quite, literally descriptive, but I just wonder whether maybe we could benefit from a new term to to make it more engaging.
There's a challenge for the attendees to come up with a new term for us in the next 30 or 40 minutes. But I just was, if you look at Edward Friedman, you mentioned Freeman's work.
Yeah.
He says it's the task is to create as much value as possible in a company for stakeholders without resorting to trade-offs. Great companies endure because they manage to get stakeholder interests aligned in the same direction. And I mean, that idea of without trade-offs seems almost an impossibility.
It's a mirage, isn't it? I mean, because you're always having to make trade-offs. So, for example, in COVID, we traded shareholder financial return for the well-being of our staff, which we thought was in shareholders' long-term interest. So whenever you're making trade-offs, you've also got to think about time frame, I think. But a life without any trade-offs would be terribly boring, wouldn't it? It'd be no fun at all. I mean, there's got to be a good measure of, you can't always get everything you want for everybody all the time, and some of them are mutually exclusive. I mean, I found the 3i, anyone out there who's been responsible for investor relations will know that shareholders are not homogenous. A long only and an activist hedge fund want very different things, and so you're not going to keep them all happy all of the time.
Now, just hang into this conversation around stakeholders for a minute. And I know you mentioned the paper from Cranfield, and they talked about swans and wands, swans and O1s. So stakeholder wants and needs and organisational wants and needs. And it's often helpful to have a model, isn't it, to work with when you start to think about stakeholders.
Yeah.
I also just wonder a couple of questions for you really about, you talked about data being key, but what about some of the key skills that boards really need, and what key models are useful when you're thinking about stakeholders? Because it can get complicated pretty quickly when you start mapping your stakeholders.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example from, when I became marketing director at 3i, I knew nothing much about marketing before, but I went around to see some really good marketing directors in the FTSE and said, what do you do? What do you spend your time on? I said, you've really got to keep the journalists happy, and I sort of said, well, that sounds fairly straightforward, doesn't it? So I asked the team, kind of how happy are the journalists? One of them said, well, who cares? They're never happy. One of them said, we do what we can. So I said, well, have we ever asked them? So I got Murray at the time to do me a quick survey of all the journalists who were involved in private equity. And I wanted to know what they think of us, how they rate us, whether they like us, what they think of all the other big private equity firms, and to do a sort of benchmarking for me. Did it really quickly, came back, said, well, we don't really like you, and we don't really rate you.
Okay.
So this was devastating, to the team. And I said, okay, so what have we got to do to get people rate us? Well, that's about performance. What have we got to do to like them? And actually, one of the biggest things was, at the time, ring them back. That really helps. It was really sort of simple things. So actually getting some data really helped. And then I had to make a presentation to the board quite quickly after being appointed about, what my strategy was. And I remember putting a slide up about PR. I said, basically, we're just going to get the journalists to like us and rate us. And I remember the chairman Marisol at the time saying, what? Is that it? is that all it is? So I thought, yeah, I think that might work. And within a year, we were the highest rated PR team in the industry. We won all the prizes, and the performance had become better of the company. And so I think, you can't ever get away from performance with investors and journalists and things like that, but you can do things to help people feel better about you. So one of the things was, no phone would ring for more than 7 rings in the team. Every journalist would get an answer within 15 minutes, even if that answer was, we don't know what that issue is, we're going to find out and we'll get back to you. But everyone, and then obviously email was quite quick as well. But I think that's a very practical example of how the board at one level, it was fed up with being slagged off in the press.
Yeah.
And at another level, how you deal with it operationally. I think that connectivity has to happen.
So you're sort of really emphasising there. It can get complicated quickly, but actually simplicity is really quite important. And I know you've talked before about this idea of a sort of graphic equalizer with regard to stakeholders. That you need to be monitoring it in a very live. I don't even know if everyone remembers what a graphic equalizer is. There might be too, maybe everyone's too young, but hopefully not.
And so if you're wondering, because Ali's got a whole disco set behind her with sort of graphic equalizers on it. Basically, if you think of a graph, a vertical and a horizontal, you've got bars across the side, and so if all your stakeholders are completely happy with you, all the bars are full across there, but some of them might not be. I mean, that's the image I always have all the time with all the boards I chair is, if I'm thinking, I remember at Warwick as well, the university, the local communities, you mentioned schools. Well, imagine if you're a university, you have a massive impact on the local community in all sorts of ways. So making sure, they're at peace with you. And they actually, better than that, they see you as a positive thing is a very important thing. So at Warwick was not obsessed, but that was really important to Warwick all the time was, what are our community relationships like in the towns around the university? That was really important.
I mean, so certainly at the moment, in terms of, if you think, I was sort of mapping out kind of the things that you do in life at the moment and that boards for different organisations need to be worrying about. But, if I think schools, universities, work, so I want to know that in my work, the people that work for me know that I am absolutely actively listening to them. But I guess it's worth a moment just thinking about, we think about listening to stakeholders maybe in a way that you talked about there in terms of data and surveys. But of course, there is the actual skill of listening. And I often think, first of all, it starts with the mindset. So what do we mean by listening? First of all, I've got to be thinking how I recognise that someone is interested in my point, that I'm interested in their point of view, how I respect them as an individual, and then how I respond. So the 3 R's. I like to call it the 3 R's. And that's a really important skill for board directors because, of course, they are so much more involved now. Many board directors are so much more involved in face-to-face communication with different stakeholder groups. That absolute ability to listen in a way which connects is really important. I wonder if you might have any thoughts on that.
I think it's absolutely true. And I think the description you used was active listening. And I think that's really important because kind of listening is just sort of hearing what someone in front of you is saying. Active listening is really concentrating on what they're saying, but also making sure you go and listen to other people who might better inform your view. So it's a bit like being open-minded and actively open-minded. You're open-minded if you're prepared to change your view, depending on someone saying something at a board meeting. Actively open-minded is you're going out and talking to people who you think might have an interesting view on it before the board meeting, so you're better informed at the board meeting. And I think listening is a bit the same. The other thing that some people who may have heard me speak about this before that's really important is I don't think just listening to what people say is enough. It's a true story about my grandmother told me as a little boy. It's really important to listen to what people think. And the only way to do that is sort of imagine what's in people's thought bubbles. So I think Zoom has actually helped in a way. I think there are pros and cons of a telephone conversation versus a Zoom thing. So on a Zoom thing, you can see people's faces and the rest of it, but it doesn't feel like it does when it's physical. To my way of thinking, the sense is slightly different. It's a bit flatter. I think it's 2-dimensional, not 3-dimensional, and so on. The voice call, I'm finding with my conversations with board members in Africa and key stakeholders in Africa that the telephone is better than Zoom. I'm picking up more. Maybe it's just me. Other people might be different, but I'm picking up more through intonation in my ear than I can on a screen.
Do you mean one-to-one or one-to-many?
Yeah, one-to-one.
Right.
One-to-one particularly, but one-to-many as well. Whereas Zoom, I think is great because you can, I can see you're happy. I see you're happier now because you're smiling. So I've been responding well. But I think there's something about the voice intonation, and I think when you've got, I find it quite easy to get sensory overload because of my dyslexia, and so I find it much easier if I can close my eyes and listen, which isn't great on a Zoom call, because people think you're closing your eyes for another reason.
Yeah. So Rosie, we just had a nice comment from Rosie. You have to make sure you speak with a range of stakeholders, not the ones who make the most noise. It's finding the quieter people who sometimes have more interesting things to say.
Oh, yes.
I know that's something. Go on.
Yeah, well, Rosie, I hope you don't mind me saying, Rosie is one of my favourite people. She's finance director at Warwick, and I think your ability, Rosie, to legendary sort of cut out the noise and listen to the introvert around the board table has always been useful. But I think that's back to this active listening. It's, don't just listen to the noisy people. They may be very valid, the noisy people. They may have things to say, and their noise might be a result of the strength of their feeling. But there are other people as well. So if you're involved in, shareholder relations, if you're in a FTSE 100, as 3Iers, the active hedge funds can consume all of your day if you're not careful. They'll be at you all the time from 7 a.m. till midnight. So you have to make sure that's not the only voice that you hear. You still have to make sure you understand what smaller shareholders feel, what quieter ones feel, and be proactive with them. But it's also the art of I think the ones who are noisy is sort of, how do you manage that noise to hear? Because sometimes when someone is very noisy, you can't really hear what they're saying. That's
right. Yeah. So so we've talked a little bit about the changing role of stakeholders and the change in the board's role in terms of making sure that they are engaging in a meaningful strategy. And that the importance of this is driven by a number of different factors, including the need to collaborate, the integratedness of the work we're doing that's been derived from COVID, but also the ambiguity. And of course, there are some regulatory changes around Section 172 that may mean boards have to pay more attention to that. And we've also talked quite a lot about actually the importance of listening and what do we really mean by listening. That sort of kind of approach to being able to recognize someone as a stakeholder, respect them, show them respect, and then respond in a way which is meaningful and shows that you are connecting with them and really genuinely want to listen to them. I just wonder whose responsibility it is on the board. Who owns stakeholder engagement, Patrick?
Well, the ultimate responsibility is the chair. That doesn't mean they're doing everything. It just means they need to make sure that, we know who our stakeholders are. And I know that sounds a stupid question, but I've come across boards that don't really understand who their stakeholders are or how important they are. We know what our objectives are. So in order to have a stakeholder strategy, you need to know what you want. Like the example I used before, I wanted us to be, the highest rated and most liked. Because in press relations, there is a value to being liked. There aren't in some areas, but there are in that, I can tell you. And so having clear objectives about what you want for each stakeholder group, and then making sure you satisfy yourself in terms of oversight, that there is support. That's the job of the board as a whole, led by the chair. On the implementation, smart boards carve up the most important stakeholders between them. And so, I might be responsible if I'm chair of a public company for, making sure that our top 3 shareholders, if there's that sort of concentration, are, You know, I need to know to satisfy myself, but also I can be helpful, hopefully, in making them, you know, that relationship going well. And it isn't just about listening. It's about what you say and how you say it and when you say it, and checking that what you've said has been listened to and heard by the other person you're speaking to. But I think the board has a responsibility, like with most things, for, you know, ensuring we know who our stakeholders are. We have clear objectives for those, and we've got a plan, and then we're implementing that plan. And we see our little graphic Equalizer dashboard showing us, you know, that one group's getting a bit grumpy and we need to do something about it, or maybe we're investing too much in keeping a group over happy, because I think you can communicate too much as well. Good communication is not lots of communication, it's good communication. And
what about competitors, Patrick? Because I kind of feel like there's probably a lot more collaboration around different in different sectors at the moment, particularly as companies are recognizing that it's really helpful to share information with competitors, so people can work out what's working well for one organization might actually be quite helpful. Have you seen much of that of late?
Yeah, although one always has to be extremely careful with, you know, regulation, competition and markets regulation in particular. And if you take the professional service firms, you know, the big accountants, you know, that one has to be extremely careful there. I think the other thing is, it's quite interesting operating in the business and the charity and the public world. I think business is more collaborative with its competitors than charities are. I mean, you know, a lot of charities are incredibly territorial about these. Businesses tend to sort of learn more from each other. It's more transparent, and it's they don't see themselves as competing for money because the capital markets are so large, whereas maybe charities in a smaller niche segment may feel they're competing for the same capital. I don't know, or it may just be a psychological thing. But I think it's a, you know, people are competitive. They're going to want to learn more from their competitors than they share with their competitors, is my experience. I think we've got to be grounded about this, particularly when the markets are tougher.
Right.
I think where it's different, I think, is with suppliers. What I've seen over the last 6 months is actually, I think people have become a lot better engaged with their suppliers. So rather than they're just, you know, we want to get whatever we can as cheaply as we can, as quickly as we can, batter them down on everything. I think people have realized that the sustainability of suppliers actually matters to you quite a lot, and actually not having just one supplier of something, so you need 2 or 3. So I've found people wanting to find out more about how their suppliers are doing. Been quite interesting.
It's quite a welcome shift, isn't it, this conversation? I found myself with the boards that I'm working with that it's a really welcome shift, this interest in engaging in actually a much more diverse set of views from different stakeholders, and wanting to have that kind of really active, meaningful and engaged kind of dialogue. And the consequences, of course, of getting it wrong are so impactful, not just in the long term, but actually in the short, at the moment, particularly in the short term. The consequences of getting it wrong are very evident very quickly.
Well, completely. And you know, I think, you know, many people have struggled to take the right approach with regard to Black Lives Matter and other issues like that, because you know, it's complex, and you need to be thoughtful about what you do. Also, I think, you know, you'd kind of hope that the good things that have come out of COVID will sustain. The bad things will go away, and there'll be a sort of step change, I think. But it's quite interesting how quickly, you know, one week everyone was saying, isn't it wonderful, all this clean air and you know, much less traffic, it's fantastic. And then all of a sudden, very quickly, you know, we've got more traffic than we had before because no one wants to use public transport. So I think the consequences are yet to really be sort of fully understood, I think, not just on what people do, but how they behave.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move us off stakeholder engagement in a minute. So just to sort of summarise, then, we know that the board's role has shifted in this. We know that it's important that stakeholders are considered more diverse. There's a more diverse group of people who are stakeholders, and we've also seen the boards that we're working with picking up this topic in a more active and engaged way. You know, I've talked a lot about listening and the importance of that. You've talked also about the importance of getting two-way communication and making sure that you follow that kind of graphic equalizer, knowing who's important when. And I particularly liked your idea around sort of almost appointing different board members to be accountable for different stakeholders, because I think that can make it a less complex kind of, in the round and the whole, it seems quite complex for the whole board to be thinking about all stakeholders all the time, but to actually break it down so different people have a sense of responsibility for different groups is a really helpful one, I think. Anything else, Patrick, on that sort of topic? Or
no, let's move on. I think it was good.
Let's talk about money for a bit.
Oh, good.
I thought we're getting to that kind of point where a lot of businesses are starting to reinvent themselves, but obviously growth or lack of growth is high on the agenda. You know, the statistics for growth in the last month were published this morning, and I know you've been talking a lot about dynamic budgeting, Patrick, and I wanted to just home in on that. So what is that exactly?
Well, I mean, I've always been a fan. Maybe it's being involved in quite a lot of early stage businesses, a fan of kind of a lockstep approach to planning and budgeting. So rather than pinning a particular date on something, there will be dates following. Don't worry for those that get freaked out by the absence of dates in a budget. But what I mean is that, you know, we need to see these things done before we move on to these other things. So we'll spend the money on these things, and when it's clear that's work, then we spend the money on the next things, rather than agreeing a budget for a whole year and then just going out and spending it. You know, then you may or may not get the revenue in, and you may or not be in trouble. Now, if you're in, you know, I started my career in the chemicals industry. You know, you don't build chemical plants to get, you know, return in 6 months. You know, this is very long extended life, so you need some framework to say for your decisions, I think. But in terms of budgeting now, I think most of the organizations I know and those I work with have moved to, they might call it agile, they might call it active, they might call it dynamic, but what they're doing is they're saying, on these assumptions, this will be our budget for the year.
Right.
But every month or every quarter, depending on what is relevant for the nature of the business, we're basically going to agree what the budget is for the next spell, whether that's a month or that, you know, and we're based on where we are at that point. And you can see very obviously now, you know, you might have planned to go spend a load of money about now because your assumption was we're all going to be back at work by now, but we're not really, are we?
No.
So, you know, that V-shape never happened, and we're in a different mind. So, you know, if we'd built up our resource, if we'd invested in kit or whatever, it would have been inappropriate. So I think, I mean, I know there are a number of finance directors on the line. They may want to comment on this, but I think more and more boards are going that way. So if you're a charity, it's basically saying, you know, we will have a minimum reserve position of this, and, you know, we're just gonna be working within that boundary to do it. I was talking to the CEO of a high-tech company yesterday. They're in a big scale-up, build-out. Large numbers of their customers are doing well, and other segments that they serve are doing disastrously. And so they are swapping people from one place to another, but their decision was to keep the budget the same overall. So rather than increase the budget in the sectors that are growing very well, right, they're actually doing something like that. So
it's quite a mindset shift in a way too.
Yeah, and it's the integration of not just the income statement, but also the cash flow and the balance sheet, because all of those three things, affect your financial resource. If you get your income and cash flow right, but your balance sheet is wrong, you might be breaching covenants with the bank, and therefore your cash position might change quite quickly. So I think one of the things boards need more than ever, and I think a lot of boards have actually increased individuals on boards have increased their understanding of the financial dynamic of the business. So one of the things that I insisted on at the beginning where I'm chair is that every board member knew what the new financial dynamic of the business or organisation was at the beginning of this. And we have regular updates on that. How are these dynamics shifting as we go through? So we understand the interrelationship between things, and we'll make better decisions as a result. Still might be very painful, still might be very hard, but at least we'll be more on top of it.
Yeah, we have you said, as you say, we have a few finance CFOs on the call. So I wonder if we might ask a poll question around, has your board moved away from annual budget cycle to a more dynamic model through the last few months, just to get a sense of what that looks like. Leslie, if you could oblige with the poll, that would be great. I mean, it sort of makes sense, and I wonder what the challenges are of doing. I mean, it sounds like a very positive thing, but I can also see that there are some real challenges with that more dynamic model.
Oh, it's really difficult for management teams. So, I want to get on and hire these people. Well, not yet. Just wait a bit. That's really can be really frustrating when their instincts are telling them, things are moving a different way, and the quicker we get on with it, the better it will be.
Yeah. I mean, the hiring thing is going to be an interesting challenge, isn't it? Because even if thinking about hiring at a board level, if the board is talking about dynamic budgeting and is putting constraints on quarter by quarter basis, it can take quite a long time to hire people. Certainly longer than a quarter often.
Yeah, and the interesting thing at the moment is the sort of crude, blunt feeling might be, oh well, there's loads of people available now. But actually, if you want to get digital people, there aren't loads of people who've got the specific skills that you probably want. So it can be quite different. I think also there is a short and long-term thing. So I was absolutely delighted. I mean, some of you know I chair the EY Foundation, which is an independent charity of EY. EY's our biggest single funder, but they decided they would carry on with the graduate recruitment, 1,000 graduates, which I was absolutely chuffed to bits with, because I think, thinking for the future of the organisation and the future of those young people as well, that was just a good decision. But they could only do that because they had the financial resource to do it. If you didn't, you couldn't.
Yeah.
It's about half, really.
Yeah. Well, and also another quarter working on it.
Yeah, and some have no plans to at all, and that might be because you're in a very happy position of having an incredibly strong balance sheet, and that still works for you, or the nature of your business might be different. But I've seen the companies that are doing really well out of COVID move to it, as well as the companies that are having a harder time.
Yeah, I mean, and so just in terms of that, we talked about actually hiring as being a challenge if you're in that kind of dynamic budgeting. Are there other things that you think, I mean, resources is an obvious thing. There are other things that you've experienced that there's a kind of pressure between the management team and the board, maybe?
Capital investment would be one thing. I don't think many people are rushing to build new offices. I think that's sort of not really something of the moment, but quite a lot of people want to change the way they work, and that has cost implications. Actually, if you want to downsize, in cash terms, that's going to cost you in the short term before you get your sort of annual savings. So one of the things I think that has been pretty interesting in the move to agile or dynamic budgeting as opposed to annual budgeting is the timing is much more important. So whereas before, particularly if you had a very healthy cash flow, you could afford to be up, down on lots of variables through the year and still meet your budget at the end of the year, where your budgets have been looked at and the consequences of the actuals in terms of the decisions you make are more significant. You've got to get your timing a bit more precise. So one thing I've noticed in one of the organizations is the CEO has got much more attentive around when things are bought, or when people are hired, than before, which is quite interesting. And I think that's an influence of this.
Yeah. So we have talked before, and I wanted to come back to this topic around the relationship between the changing role of the non-exec and the relationship between the exec team and the non-execs or the board as a whole. I'm just wondering what you're seeing. Are you seeing more tension at the moment, Patrick? Are you seeing relationships? I think the polls we've had so far have shown that the board's relationship with the exec generally over the last few months has improved. But what are your working experiences of that at the moment?
I think what I'm seeing is more variability now. So in the beginning, we all had an absolutely aligned objective: keep everyone safe, keep the business surviving, whatever. I think as time has gone by, I think people have got quite tired. So a lot of people are tired, and a lot of people didn't actually get to take a break. And this is the point where you would naturally worry, because it looks like there might be issues. The vaccines might not be coming as quickly as hoped. There may be more restrictions. All of these things are sort of, you thought once you got to the autumn things would be a bit better, and now all of a sudden they're looking a bit more vulnerable again. Also, I think people have spent a lot of time with each other, and just like with your family, you might love them madly, but they also drive you nuts from time to time. And if you're sort of spend too much time together, that's also not as good as not spending enough. So there's a bit of that. So I think there's a stamina influence. There's a sort of contextual sort of anxiety around. Also, I think people who were delaying making appointments to boards because they, many chairs I know, I had a chat with a couple of chairs because I appointed a number of people now as the board's chair who I haven't met. And it's really uncomfortable sort of doing that, but I felt the need was right, and we should do that. Some of my friends will not do that ever. They have to shake the hand. They have to sort of see the person, and so they've gone without someone who might have actually helped over the last 6 months, and that's starting to show.
And so, like just personally, are you glad you did go ahead with the hiring, despite the fact that you couldn't shake their hands, as it were?
Yeah, in fact, so my best example of this is there's 3 amazing women we've appointed to ESSA, Education Sub-Saharan Africa. One is the CEO of Microsoft Kenya, the other one is CEO of MultiChoice, and another one is the legendary Dalika Banda, who is sort of legend in sort of African finance. And the contribution they have made in a few months has been staggering. We took our time, they took their time because it's a two-way thing, but they've added so much value to the organization. I am so pleased that we did it. We had a discussion, should we wait? I was due to go to Zambia and that had to get cancelled, so I couldn't do that trip. I was due to go to Nairobi and we couldn't do that. And we just cracked on, and it was good. Now, there might be other situations other people have had not been as lucky, but I'm so glad we did that. And
so, would you do it again? So going forward, would you make hires virtually regardless now going forward? Do you feel reassured by
that? Yes, I would. I think the word regardless always carries a hint of risk about it. So I think I've learned something from the way we did the selection panels on that. We did You know, probably, I mean, I always like to do quite a lot of, I always like to do my own telephone references anyway, on people, but we did more and longer calls because we hadn't met the person. And so I think, you know, you adapt and learn as you go, don't you? But you know, it's a big net positive so far, so that would encourage me to do it again. But whether the circumstances would be the same is, you know, might require a different approach. I don't know.
So, I mean, you strike me, always have struck me, Patrick, as someone who's got a very positive mindset of always thinking about if we want to achieve this, how can we do it, rather than being held back by the situation and the circumstance. And mindset is so important. And I was just struck by Naomi Thomas's question here.
Yeah.
You spoke of the key drivers in the shifts in stakeholder conversations, influenced by regulatory and response to COVID-19. How much influence are the longer term considerations? So
I can give you a brilliant example of this, actually, from ESSA. So one of the things we've been working on is a scholarship impact hub, because I don't feel a lot of scholarships deliver. There are high fraud rates, there are high dropout rates, and actually a lot of scholarships go to people who don't need them, and many deserving children who don't. Now, one of the SDGs, SDG 4, is around quality education. And so we came up with what we thought was a really good framework, a KPI framework for doing scholarships, based on studying 400 scholarship programs and trying to figure out what were the characteristics of the best. And we went to UNESCO and said, you know, we'd like these to be adopted by as many people, and they said yes, and we did that. Then we got 40 funders of scholarships together to say, look, you know, this is what we've learned. And they haven't all adopted them yet, but a decent number have. And that's changing the way that scholarships are done. And that's not going to happen very quickly. But that's a sort of thinking about who's the stakeholder in this. Well, it's the scholar, it's the funder of the scholarship, and it's actually, you know, companies, organizations in Africa who want to employ scholars. I think they're going to get better scholars now. I think the money is going to go further as well. So not only will, you know, because fraud rates are quite high, not only will more scholars graduate, get proper jobs, but also I think more money will flow into scholarships because people have more confidence that they will have an impact. So I think that's a good example of thinking about, you know, it's not just about the scholar, it's thinking about the other people in that chain. We've also found a new group of happy people who are people who manage scholarship programs, who always feel like they're a bit in the cupboard and undervalued and underappreciated. And they didn't have a mechanism for sharing best practice, and they now have one. So we've got a new group of stakeholders now to keep happy.
And I think, Naomi, also to answer your question, one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about this topic today was, I think, the fundamental belief that actually for the long term, for sustainability of business, build back better, understand actually who really are the or can be the drivers of your business success, not just in the short term, but in the long term. It is vital, really, that boards have a much better comprehensive understanding of their stakeholders and the consequences, positive and negative, of knowing those groups well, understanding the prioritization of those groups, and using the respective views as a way to help decision making. You know, one of the mistakes I often see boards make is that they engage with stakeholders in a way which is a little bit too late. So that they've almost really started to make decisions about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And then they reach out to different stakeholder groups. And then it's actually a struggle to change the decision. So I like to say a good practice is to be able to prioritize without getting to that point of making a decision. You know, what are the different priorities of our different stakeholder groups? Do we know them? Do we understand them? How well do they align to our priorities as we see them? And then move forward. And that actually leads you to a much better decision-making process.
I mean, I think it's a very simple language thing as well. If I say to you, you know, I want to get your views to help shape my decision, I'm going to be thinking about that differently to if I say to you, I want to hear your views to confirm what I've decided. It's just, you know, you're going to feel differently, aren't you?
Yeah, so it's a completely different level of engagement, and to your point, Hansa, it's really about trust and confidence. And I think the earlier that stakeholders experience that they are, you know, listened to, and I use the word listen to, but I really mean connected with. You know, good listening connects you to people, connects you to groups, and it is that ability to connect in a meaningful way that drives trust and confidence.
There's a quick question come in, Ali. It's how do boards work on stimulating a trust and confidence environment? I mean, it probably is fundamentally back to the people that you've got around the table. So if you don't trust each other, if you don't have confidence in each other, then it's hard for you to create that culture in the rest of the organization. But I think the board has to basically build a culture where, you know, and trust is not just trusting what people say, it's relying on them to be competent, to do the right thing and all those things. And we've seen fantastic examples through COVID of that, where, you know, I saw EY Foundation, all sorts of places, people just doing the right thing without having to be told any of that thing. I just trusted them to do the right thing. You obviously oversee and know what's going on, but that's a thing. Confidence is actually, maybe it's a topic of another chat, because I think a lot of people's confidence took a battering to start with, and then a lot of people's confidence rose quite sharply because they thought, you know, my God, we managed to do that. So things which seemed impossible, people did, and that gave a real injection of confidence, I think, to many people. Of course, there were other people, sadly, who didn't pull off the thing that they were trying to do and felt dejected by that and felt that they'd failed. But I think a board's job, really, it's part of the culture aspect of a board's role, is to make sure you've got that culture of trust and confidence in each other. You haven't got divisiveness, and you haven't got people playing too many games. People always play games to some degree, but not too much.
So Leslie has appeared, which means that
time
is coming to. I think just really thank you so much, Patrick. And I think, you know, just one word, really, if all of you board members out there, go and have a look at your stakeholder engagement strategy, and really share the conversation with the rest of your board members, and just bring some stories back to us about what you do and how you do it, and the impact and value that it has.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Ali. That was absolutely fascinating as always. And I think the whole thing about not just hearing, but listening and taking notice of what people say is just so important. Thank you all to you who've attended and for asking questions and what have you. We will be sending around, this has been recorded, we will be sending you a link with the recording, and I'll also give you a link to the Cranfield report that Patrick mentioned. And if we think of anything else that you might be interested in, we'll send that as well. Thanks a lot, and stay safe. Thanks everyone, bye.